Welcome to medieval cooking in our camp. Today we're going to be cooking a 14th century vegetable pottage. We'll be using a couple of different recipes out of the Forme of Cury from the Cury on English and combining them to make our own variation using different medieval components, using the ingredients and techniques from the recipes cabbages in pottage and chibolache or chibolish. So the first recipe reads, cabbages in pottage. Take cabbages and quarter them, and seethe them in good broth with onions minced and the white of leeks slit and cored small. And do thereto saffron and salt, and force it with powdered deuce. And our other recipe for chibolache, take onions and herbs and hew them small, and do thereto good broth, and array it as thou didst cabbages. If they be in fish day, make them in the same manner with water and oil, but if it not be in Lent, ale it with yolks of eggs and dress it forth, and cast thereto powdered deuce. So because I'm a vegetarian, when I'm cooking medieval recipes, I actually like to look for Lenten recipes because those are the ones that we cooked on a fish day where you're not eating meat. So in this case we're going to be using a vegetable oil instead of the eggs, and we're going to be using a vegetable-based broth instead of a meat broth. So one of the steps is we're gonna take our leeks and we're going to clean them first before we add them into our pottage, because leeks are notorious for having lots of mud and dirt in them. So you'll want to slice your leeks and actually slice them lengthwise a little bit, because you'll get mud down between the layers sometimes, and you want to let this soak in water for a while and maybe even kind of squish it around in the water to get that mud out from between the leaves. And our recipe just calls for the white part of the leaves, but I'm going to save this for making a broth. So we'll cut off the end. We're going to cut sort of the meat part of it and slit it. So look for mud and grit, because as they grow up through the soil, they kind of get mud infiltrated between all the leaves. Alright, so our recipes didn't really tell us what manner we're going to be cooking things in, and because we have onions in the recipe, I actually would like to do the oil first and get the onions sort of browned before we add our broth and other vegetables and let them cook down. This here. Our pot is sort of sitting on the fire, and we're going to add some oil. Get smoke in our eyes. So we have about 1 onion's worth of onion chopped up here. I could just say we have an onion chopped up there. So we've got good olive oil here with the onions. And we're going to let this brown for a minute until they get kind of clear. And then we're going to add our broth, and we could have used the ends of the leeks and some other things and cooked it down and made our own vegetable broth and strained out all the bits, but we didn't really have time for that, so we just bought cubes of vegetable bouillon and added that to hot water, and we'll be using that as our broth base. You could also use commercial chicken stock or beef stock or something along that lines if you are not doing the Lenten version of this dish. Our onion browning, and we want to let it get so it looks sort of gold and clear. We're not quite there yet. And we're using a vegetable oil because we're doing the Lenten or fish day variation on this recipe. But you could also use butter if you were not in Lent.
Or bacon grease.
Or bacon grease. Alright, so our onions, you can see here, have gone kind of golden brown and soft. There's a few little charred ones, but that's okay. You want them to get sort of that clear color and texture, and that way they will be extra tasty in our soup. And now we're going to add our broth, which we have heating here. I think we have about 3 cups. And if we end up needing more liquid, we'll just add some water. Alright, and let me get my other supplies. So we have, I believe, 4 leeks. Of which are going into the fire. a half of a cabbage because we're combining the cabbage recipe with the leek recipe. Let's give it a stir. And right now this seems pretty thick, although pottages often are a really pretty thick stew. We could have chopped things finer too, and we can let things cook down until they're sort of a mush. I like my soups a little bit chunkier, so I didn't chop them super fine. And we have some parsley and chervil and a few other herbs that would be appropriate. And let's add a little more water because that looks too thick. So we want it to be kind of soupy. So it's maybe another 2 cups worth or so. And we're going to add some powdered deuce. And that, you have to be kind of sparing with this because this has sugar in it, and if you don't want it to get too sweet. It has cinnamon, sugar, ginger, cloves, grains of paradise, and nutmeg. And this would have been an imported specialty. But it shows up in a lot of these recipes, like it was quite a popular thing. So we have that. And we're going to do a couple pinches worth. Stir that in. So we have here some strands of saffron. Is that in focus? And this is something that we're going to add to the recipe because it calls for it. But if you were a poorer person, you obviously wouldn't have access to this. But these recipes come from the household of, I think, King Richard II of England. So his cooks could afford some saffron. So we're going to add that to the broth. And that will give it sort of a yellowish color as those sit there. And we also want to add some salt. And this is going to be to taste, but we have some sea salt here. And we'll start with just a couple pinches, and maybe add some more later if we need it. And these recipes, they all are written without amounts, so they're not like a modern recipe. We kind of have to redact them through trial and error to get to what we think tastes good and seems like a reasonable approximation of medieval food. The recipes were written for experienced cooks, so they were almost more like shorthand. Like they just give you a reminder, kind of like a cheat sheet of what sort of ingredients you should put in the dish, but they don't tell you amounts or cooking methods so much. So here we have our stew, and we're going to let this sit over the fire for maybe another half hour, hour or so until it's all cooked down and good.
Hello and welcome to Cooking in Our Camp. I'm Keitha and we're going to be making vine grace this morning. So this is a pork stew, and the first instruction of the pork is to take small fillets of pork and to cook them directly on the fire first. So we're going to put both of our pieces of pork onto a hot fire, and then once they are browned on this side, we're going to flip them over. And then after that, we are going to follow the directions and hack them into gobbets and make stew. So we've cooked our meat on the fire for about 5 minutes. It's quite a hot fire. And our pieces of pork are now halfway done. So we're going to take them off. They're nice and brown on the outside. But as we hack them into gobbets, you can see that they are still raw on the inside of the pork.
Mm.
So all of our pieces of pork are going to get cut up into pieces, and the size of your gobbets is totally up to you. However large of gobbets you feel are suitable for a stew. And I am making this dish as a more liquid stew. It could also be essentially pork in a sauce, but I have chosen to make a pork stew. So I've been cutting up raw pork and handling raw pork all morning, but luckily soap is also a perfectly valid medieval object. So it's time for hand washing to commence. My handy kitchen helper is going to pour some water over my hands, and I am going to wash. now we are ready to go on to the rest of the ingredients. So we're going to finish adding ingredients to our pork and wine stew, as so far all we have is pork and we need to add wine. So directions say to add good wine, so we're going to add a large amount of a fairly cheap vintage of red wine. And all of this is subject to your redaction of the recipe. And redaction means to specify amounts. So if you notice, none of the actual period recipes have any amounts specified. So to redact is to take the list of ingredients given as a period recipe and make it into a more modern recipe. So my version of this, my redaction, is that it is quite stew-like, very soupy. The other ingredients are some apple cider vinegar, a chopped onion, and good powders, which in this case is black pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg. All of this is going to be stirred together and then put over the fire and allowed to stew until everything is cooked and soft. And we're going to add salt at the very end, and then the directions say, and serve it forth. So vine grace is a little bit unusual in that most medieval boiled meat dishes just direct you to boil the meat in the liquid, not to sear it on the outside first. So as far as medieval recipes go for stew-like things, this one is a little bit unusual.
Alright, this is Matilda and Keitha, and we're back here, and here comes the moment of truth. We're going to try our two concoctions cooked over the fire. They've been cooking down for an hour or so. So there's the leek and cabbage pottage. Really good. Hot, but really good.
And I have pork in wine stew.
Try. Don't burn your mouth.
This is really good. The taste of the wine has soaked into the meat, and the onions have flavored the broth really well.
Yum, yum, yum.
Matilda?
We switch. Nice and cookie. Nice and veggie. Bad vegetarian.